There's a place He comes to me. Though I'm blind, He helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see Him face to face.
This is Kurt Kaikkonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Face to Face, we'll be in the book of Exodus. So grab your Bibles and let's get started. If you want to hear this complete message in its entirety, go to yourneighborhoodchurch.com, where you can download Your Neighborhood Church app at the App Store. Okay, and then at the end, we're told that Moses has been sustained miraculously for these 40 days on the mountain, without any bread, without any water. And this reminds us of Jesus, when Jesus was tempted by the devil, where he had been sustained also for 40 days and 40 nights without any bread or any water. And that's where Jesus told the devil that man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. And so that's exactly what happened to Moses here. He was sustained by God's words up there for the last 40 days. So now this is the second set of 40 days for Moses on Mount Sinai. Now, Moses, he comes back down with this new set of tablets, and there's a much different response than the first time that he came down. And you would think that Moses, he'd be all tired and emaciated after that 40-day fast, but he's not. But everybody's afraid of him, and they won't come near him. And it's not because he doesn't look good, but it's because he's shining. So he looks like he's some kind of alien. But the truth is, he's never looked this good in his life. But Moses, he's unaware of the way he looks. He doesn't know that he's all shining. So that means that Moses, he probably didn't get ready and comb his hair and look in the mirror before seeing the people. And it does say that Moses is the most humble man in the land. And I believe this proves it. But Moses, he must have been shining pretty good, because they saw this shining, but then somehow Moses, he persuades them to all come near. And if you ever notice people, when they spend a lot of time with God, or sometimes you feel this presence, or they have this kind of a glow about them, and you see it in their eyes or in their smile, and it's usually coming from the inside. And so that tells us that spending time with God improves your looks. And you may look at me and say, well, Kirk, you probably need to spend a little bit more time with God. And I would agree. I'd say, well, maybe you should too. Not all of you, but maybe some of you. And then there's some people that think that Moses put this veil on his face so that the people wouldn't be afraid of him. But that's not why he does it. Moses puts the veil on his face so the people don't see that God's glory is fading, that Moses was losing the look of the presence of God. And Moses, he didn't want the people losing confidence in him leading the people. And that word for shone here literally means shot forth beams. All right. So now a little history or a little side note. If any of you have ever seen any art from like the Middle Ages, and you've seen like statues of Moses, and you see like he has these little horns on his head, and you think, what the heck? Why does Moses have these little horns on his head? Because you kind of think, well, is he kind of like the devil? That's all comes from a mistranslation of this Hebrew word for shone. Because in the Latin Vulgate, the Hebrew verb for shone is very similar to the Hebrew noun for horns. So now we end with Moses, where he's now wearing this veil in front of the people because he doesn't want them to see his glory fading. But then when he meets before the Lord, he takes the veil off so that he gets a recharge. And that's just like us here, where God's presence in us also fades when we don't spend enough time with the Lord. And it's often noticeable. So last week, the people of Israel, they'd been restored to God, where God had renewed that covenant with Israel. And so we saw Moses returning with those new copies of the Ten Commandments. And now God has promised to dwell with Israel and to lead them into the promised land of Canaan. So now Moses, along with the people, they need to build the holy tabernacle where God's presence will dwell. But before any of the work of the tabernacle begins, In chapter 25, we see that he gathers the people and then he reminds them that Israel, that they're going to have to honor the Sabbath, that they can't neglect this rest that God's commanding them, that this to God is very serious. Because just because Israel is about to do this big work, the building of the tabernacle, it doesn't mean that they can break the Sabbath. And so we see in verse 3 that Israel, they're not even to kindle a fire on the Sabbath. So everything for the Sabbath is going to have to be prepared the day before. And it's still that way in Israel today, where the Jews, they won't even kindle a fire, but they won't even start a pot of coffee on the Sabbath. So all the pots for all the hot water, for the coffee and for the tea, they're started the evening before, Friday evening, before the sun goes down. And it seems like death would be a pretty steep penalty for not keeping the Sabbath. And I don't believe it's so much because they weren't getting enough rest, but it's for disobeying something that God says is mandatory for them. Because the Sabbath, it wasn't a minor issue. It was a major issue. It was the only thing that made the Jews different from all the other peoples. And so this observance, it showed their loyalty. And anyone not keeping the Sabbath, they weren't loyal. And they were flagrantly showing their disdain for God and their disdain for his laws. And there's two Hebrew words for work. One is avodah, and the other one is melakach. And it was that melakach, that was the work that wasn't supposed to be performed on the Sabbath. And that's the kind of work that's more related to doing any business. God did allow for avodah, for some work, but not any work of doing regular business, because this was supposed to be rest. And so now if you scan through and look at the chapters from like 35 to 40, you'll notice that most of these subjects are subjects we already covered a lot in detail when we went through chapters 25 and 31. They are those chapters all about the construction of the tabernacle and all of its furniture, its utensils, all the priestly garments, the incense, the oils, the consecration of the priests. And so we won't be covering those again today in detail. But there are some differences between these chapters. And when we looked at them a few weeks ago, what we were looking at is that we were looking at the instructions to Moses for what he was to build in the future, which were all the things that God had shown him on Mount Sinai, where God had showed him all the patterns of the tabernacle of heaven. Then he gave him the instructions of how to build them on earth. But today's chapters are about Moses implementing all the things that God had already instructed him to do, to show us everything was done correctly. And that's how we get through all these 5 chapters in just one day, because that's what these chapters are here to show us, that Moses was faithful in carrying out everything that God had instructed him. And so the first thing that we see here is that Moses begins to take that offering that God had commanded him to receive way back there in chapter 25. Okay, so now here in chapter 35, this is Moses actually taking the offering. And there was only one restriction for this offering, and that was that everything that's offered had to be given with a willing heart. So Moses, he's not using any sales techniques here. He's not trying to persuade people to dig deep or to give more generously than they wanted to out of some sense of guilt. Because it is true that guilt can be a big motivator to give, but God, he never uses the guilt method. He only receives offerings from cheerful, willing givers, people who have a heart to give willingly. Though the church, at sometimes, they can use guilt, and sometimes they'll do it by quoting like Malachi 3:8 about robbing God in your tithes and offerings, and then they go and take the offering. But that's not here in Exodus. Back here in Exodus, they're not even passing a plate around. They all had to go home. They had to think about what they wanted to give, and then they brought back their offering of what they wanted to give. So this is not the common way of collections are collected today in many of the churches. But I do hope that this is the way that we will always take offerings, with no pressure applied. where everything is given willingly with no guilt. So here at this church, what we try to follow is the same method that Chuck Smith taught at his Calvary Chapel in Costa Mesa, where he believed that God will provide for everything that he wants to do here. And it'll be out of the generosity of the hearts that God is leading. And it also is reflected in our language that we use for offerings. We don't take offerings, but we receive them. So we're never going to ask you for money here. We would rather shut down and sell the building first than to ask you for anything that you don't want to give. Because if it's not giving willingly, it won't do you any good, and God doesn't really receive it. But here we do expect God to do a work, but it's not a work that's only going to come from us. It's not going to be a work that's only done from our abilities and from our resources. Here, we're expecting God to do a work, and he is only allowing us to be a part of his work for the work that he initiates. And that's only if we're willing to follow him in it. So just like Israel here, that's the way it should be for us. And that's the way it should be for all the ministries that come out of this church, where we're going to expect God to stir up and provide our people with not only the resources, but the willing hearts to be able to lead in these ministries. And then if he doesn't do this, then we won't have them, because we're not going to guilt anyone into serving into any ministry that they don't want to be a part of. And that could be anything to do with working with children or to even cleaning the bathrooms. But here in this chapter, we don't see anything like that. But we do see that Israel is being very, very generous here. And I think the reason for their generosity is that they realize that it was the Lord who gave them all this wealth, where they didn't have anything when they were slaves in Egypt. And in this offering, we're given an idea of how much wealth the Egyptians actually gave to Israel to leave Egypt when they wanted to get rid of them, because they did. They wanted them out of Egypt. And so if you go through all the numbers here of how much gold, silver, and bronze is used in the building of this tabernacle, you come up with over 1 ton of gold. You come up with 4 tons of silver and 2.5 tons of bronze. And that's not even mentioning the value of the gems that were used or the spices or the other materials. And some people say that this is equal to about $13 million in value. But I believe there's another good reason why Israel is being so generous here. Because if you remember, Israel had already given a great offering of gold for the building of an idol, that building of the golden calf, where they didn't even blink. And they tore off the gold earrings from their own ears to make a false god. So now here, God is offering Israel a second chance to not do something for something false or for a lie, but to do something with eternal consequences, to do something of value, not only for them, but for their children and for the future generations of their descendants.
You've been listening to Face to Face. Face to Face on this radio station has been provided by Your Neighborhood Church. If you want to help support Face to Face and put this program on other stations just like yours, you can contact us at yourneighborhoodchurch.com or write Your Neighborhood Church, P.O. Box 500, Romeo, Michigan 48065.
There's a place he comes to me. Though I'm blind, he helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see him face to face.
Tune in again tomorrow at this same time as we continue to go through the Bible.